Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Laudetur Jesus Christus.
In secula.
This is Timothy S. Flanders. This is the Meaning of Catholic. I'm joined today by Kennedy Hall and Jeremiah Bannister, Meaning of Catholic contributors. How y'all doing?
Good.
Doing good.
Excellent. Hope everyone is well. Everybody's virus-free. Be sure to offer up all your suffering for those who are suffering, and we all work together to get through this insane crisis. We're going to talk today about a very contentious issue, which is called liberalism, aka secular democracy, which is very related to the coronavirus outbreak because that is very related to globalism, which is a fruit of liberalism. So we're going to go into all that. We live in a liberal world, which means a world dominated by the liberal order. When we say that, we don't mean liberal like leftists. Yeah. It's not what we mean. The classical term liberalism simply means basically freedom. We're going to define it very generally, intentionally here. But what we're going to do tonight, this is going to premiere tomorrow around noon, so it'll be today. What we're going to do here is we're going to take the first part of this show. We're going to try to provide as much as possible an unbiased historical overview to try to give everybody some context here. Then we're going to have two special guests join us. That is two very big defenders of liberalism, which are going to be Timothy Gordon and John Zmirak. And they're going to give us their best defense of the liberal order. And then we're going to see what is the critique of the liberal order. And the reason we're going through this issue, in my opinion, I think it is the issue which divides Catholics today, because from my view, I think that at the root of our disagreements really comes down to a disagreement about this movement that's been going on since the late 18th century. And that's my view. If you want more details for this history, if you go on the playlist, there is a playlist called History, and there's a series on Catholic social history, goes into a lot more detail. There's also a series on the website called The Modern Catholic Liberal Disaster, Why Conservatives and Trads Must Unite. That's all about the history, so it goes through that. So we're going to try to provide a little historical context, but before we do that, I want to very quickly get your take. What is liberalism in 3 sentences? Kennedy, what do you think?
Liberalism in 3 sentences. A no to God and a yes to man. Basically an exaltation of the natural and the rational, and a rejection of sanctifying grace in the aim for perfection of man through his own faculties. That's what I think.
All right, Jeremiah.
I wouldn't be so hardcore on it.
Kennedy's showing his biases already.
I would say, yeah. And I would say that it's gone through many different definitions. Historically, it's been to be intellectually independent, to be broad-minded, frank, open, genial, and I think that the basic idea is that you're able to be free. Okay, whether intellectually, with your words, with your actions, that to the extent that would be lawful, which is I think where the debate is. Where is that line between what ought to be lawful and what ought not to be lawful? That the general ruling principle would be no force. Okay, and that would be the overriding principle that kind of underlies every single aspect of this as it affects society culturally, politically, and economically.
Yeah, so I think like etymologically, liberalism is freedom. Simply comes from the Latin word for free. So it's just all about freedom. And I just want to take that first as a very general definition, because Gordon is going to, I mean, he might get into it on the show, contrast between republicanism and democracy. And he will contrast those two. So I just want to make it very broad and say liberalism is basically just all about freedom. Cahill, so from framework of a Christian state, he defines it this way. He says, liberalism in the 18th century is used to denote those tendencies and principles in intellectual, religious, political, and economic life which imply a partial or total emancipation of man from the obligations of the supernatural order and even from the authority of God. So what that means is, we've talked before on our show, you can go back and watch the basics of Catholic social teaching, the non-negotiables. And what we talked about there was that there's three forms of government that the church accepts. That is monarchy, oligarchy, and republic. And republic, we're just going to define very broadly as a representative form of government. So people vote to make decisions. I'm just going to make it very broad intentionally because there's a lot of different forms of that. But I want to identify three key aspects. One is political, another is economic, and another is cultural. And I want to contrast the way that republics worked before 1776 and the way they worked after 1776.
Okay, good call.
So first one is political. Now, in the political realm, there's not a large difference because we're just talking about generally just representative. You vote. That's the main thing that's going to be somewhat consistent, the same or similar. You're still voting either in republics before and after, but the first big major difference that I see is economic. So before, economics was in the moral realm. It's all about moral theology, making a just transaction, the condemnation of usury. Whereas republics after 1776, there is an emphasis of economics on much more of a physics, more of like a physics game, like it's just the force of gravity. Here's a quote from free trade apostle Richard Cobden from 1846. He says, quote, "I see in the free trade principle that which shall act on the moral world as the principle of gravitation in the universe, drawing men together, thrusting aside the antagonism of race and creed and language, and uniting us in the bonds of eternal peace." End quote. So he basically, he makes this contrast with sort of this gravitation. Like if we just set up this system, it's just kind of work on itself and just sort of work itself out. And it's not so much we need to determine all these moral principles. It's just a new system that's going to sort of more or less work for itself. It's much more of a physics type of mindset. The other thing, and the biggest, most obvious difference is culture. Now, when we talk about culture, I'm talking about the cultus, which is the religious right of the state. Before 1776, every state had a cultus, every one of them, without exception. They all had a cultus. The king or ruler had to offer some sort of cultus to the divine, to supplicate the divine or whatever. So there was a cultus, that religious right, and that's what flows and informs the morals, the mores, everything else in the society flows from that cultus. And the cultus of republics before 1776, the Catholic republics that is, was the holy sacrifice of the Mass. That was the cultus. The cultus after 1776 begins to become basically the secular state itself becomes the cultus, where there's sort of a worshiping of the state itself. So the state no longer has an official cultus. It's sort of its own thing. But since man is by natural law inclined towards a cultus, he naturally inclines himself towards some sort of right. And so these nations have these different sort of culti, which are sort of the nations. So real quick, and I know you probably have objections or anything, so write those down or something, because we're gonna have, I think Gordon's gonna come on in about 15 minutes. I just want to get through real quick.
Yeah, I'm typing away over here.
Oh, good.
You're hearing the clickety clack over here. It's what's going on.
I saw you cock your head like, what is he saying? So I just want to quick, and the reason I'm making these general statements, there's always exceptions to all these general statements. And what I'm trying to do is give some general things that are true most of the time historically. I'm not saying it's always that way. I'm trying to give people generalizations to give them a general picture. That's all. So I want to first talk about American Revolution, 1776. it divides Catholics from the very beginning. So you had John Carroll, the first bishop of the United States, is actually excommunicated by the Canadian bishop Briand of Quebec during the Revolutionary War because.
Shout out.
And we have a Canadian here with us. So you guys venerate Bishop Briand?
I think in Quebec they've tried to forget that they're Catholic anyway, so I'm not sure anymore.
Yeah. So John Carroll was excommunicated. So they were divided over that because a lot of the revolutionaries were using anti-Catholic propaganda to push their revolution, and so there was this big division among Catholics at the time. Some siding with the Patriots, some siding with the British Crown. But then you had that revolution spawned, or at least helped in some ways, the next revolution, which was 1789, the French Revolution, which was virulently anti-Catholic, which attacked the church, committed genocide in the Vendée, killing men, women, and children, entire villages against the Catholics, just brutality everywhere. Whereas the American was sort of soft secularism, which is where 9 out of the 13 original colonies did have a state church. It was Protestant, but they did have a state cultus, whereas the federal government was secular. So there was no state, there was no federal cultus. But then in 1789, you also have the birth of pornography. So the Marquis de Sade, one of the revolutionaries in France, he says, let's parade naked women in theaters. That's what we'll do to create revolution. So this is the beginning of the use of pornography to create a cultural revolution in the cultus. So they also changed the cultus in the French Revolution intentionally to try to change the entire culture, all the morals and everything. And this was really the birth of using that. And then you had a third copycat revolution in Ireland, 1798. That revolution was a failure because it was suppressed by the British Crown. But what you have is that during this time and into the 19th century, throughout the 19th century, you have escalating bloodshed, escalating revolutions. But at the same time, there's this industrial revolution going on, which creates an escalating economic prosperity where people are getting richer and richer and richer, but they're also taking all the farmers and putting them in the cities, putting them in the factories. But it's also the birth of a great deal of technology. But it ends up creating also a ton of poverty and
disease.
So what happens here in the 19th century, I want to summarize the biggest problem that the church faced. And that is in the 19th century, because there was so much poverty with this urbanization, there was a great deal of secularization that happened during this century. And the biggest, this is according to historian Owen Chadwick. He writes a book called Secularization of Europe in the 19th Century. His conclusion is the reason that there was secularization in Europe during this century is because all of the people flocked to these cities. They were urbanized. They were living in poverty in the factories. And the church was trying to back the old order. So the old guard, the monarchies, the hierarchies of the old world. And along comes the revolutionaries, who are either the communists or the liberals, the Republicans. And they're promising freedom. They're promising prosperity. They're saying, we care about you. They're basically the people get swept up in these movements, and the church is left standing behind this old guard, which doesn't seem to have been helping them very much. So there's a strong secularization.
Right.
And I'm gonna wrap this up real quick, and then you guys can give me your take on some of the stuff. So what happens is Pius IX takes a very strong stand. He's initially trying to conciliate with the liberals, but then they have a huge revolution. It's 1848. It's a big year of revolutions. They kill one of his ministers. He flees Rome. He comes back with an army. Now he just condemns all liberalism. He goes at it. There's a syllabus of errors, condemns multiple liberal concepts. In particular, one of the condemns errors, according to Blessed Pius IX, is the church should be separated from the state and the state from the church.
Right.
So there's that cultus again. That's like that central piece of the liberal mindset is that we're supposed to be liberated from the state church. But ultimately they have Vatican I and the Italian army breaks into Rome, stops it. And then from there, you basically have the popes are flip-flopping. Basically, you had certain Pius IX allowed, like, he conciliated with the liberals a little bit, but then you have Leo XIII. He does a great conciliation with the liberals in France. 1891, he calls upon the French Catholics to abandon their monarchy hopes, basically, to restore the monarchy and work with the French Republic. Okay. Mm-hmm. But then that gets reversed by Pius X. Pius X reverses that, and he sets up Sodalitium Pianum, which is also run by the monarchist Benigni, who also later supports fascism. But then that is then reversed by the next pope, by Benedict XV, who suppresses that. And then after that, there's sort of a cascade towards liberalism. Pius XI suppresses Action Française, which is the monarchist organization in France. Mm-hmm. Then in 1936, Integral Humanism is written by Jacques Maritain. And that is basically the founding document of all of our conciliar world, which is where Maritain argued that we all need to kind of make peace with the modern world. We need to make peace with secular liberalism. We all just need to work together. And Giovanni Montini, who was a bishop, he read that work and he loved it so much, he translated it into Italian. And that whole concept is basically the entire Second Vatican Council. In fact, I think Paul VI wanted to dedicate. Montini is Paul VI, by the way. Montini becomes Paul VI. He enacts Maritain's dream of integral humanism at Vatican II. And he says, and then in 1965, and I'm going to stop with this, and you guys can give me some of your takes on this. 1965, he takes off his tiara, which used to be a cultus of the cult, which said things like he is the ruler of the whole world. He is the ruler of kings and princes. That's what Pius XII, his tiara. He takes off his tiara, and then he goes to the United Nations and he says, quote, I give you, quote, solemn moral ratification of this lofty institution, end quote. And he says, quote, he is convinced that this organization, the UN, represents the obligatory path of modern civilization and world peace, end quote. So that is basically the dream of Jacques Maritain, placing all the hope in the UN in this sort of secular humanism, secular liberalism, cooperation idea, putting this whole thing together and putting this dream into place. So, and that's the world we live in now in terms of the Catholic Church and the social dynamic. So that's a little bit of it. I'm trying to point out that there is a little bit of a back and forth with the popes, even going back. I mean, I didn't even mention Pius VII, even 1800. Pius VII even is conciliatory as well with the Republicans. So anyways, give me your take, and we'll have Gordon on in a few minutes. Jeremiah, what do you have to say?
A number of things, but I guess I wanted to kind of remind everyone too that there was, and I was looking this up as you were talking there at the end. You can find this at theamericancatholic.com, where it talks about Pope Leo XIII on America and George Washington. And I thought it was an interesting thing that he talks about when talking about America. This is obviously into our experiment here. And he says in paragraph 4, he says, with Catholic aid that America achieved liberty and independence. Okay, so it wasn't describing our notion of liberty as licentiousness, right? It described it as liberty. Coalesced into a constitutional republic. The ecclesiastical hierarchy was happily established amongst you. And so I felt that the pontiff's understanding of the United States in that way, to this degree, was charitable, especially, and this is something I'm sure Timothy Gordon, I've heard him kind of talk a little bit about this. I'm excited to pick his brain a little bit and see where he may disagree with Dr. Gary North in his book, Political Polytheism. But the influence of the specific brand of Freemasonry that influenced the founding of this country, and how that may have differed from Freemasonry that other kinds of Freemasonry, right? And so to say the particular rite that was prominent and prevalent here in the United States, and the understanding and interplay with religion and Freemasonry, specifically Christianity, or even Newtonian theology, which was kind of in vogue at that time. I'm interested to see what he. I'm interested to see kind of where he stands on it. And so that's one thing. The other thing was this: is when talking about whether.
Are you okay? Good.
Yeah, sorry about that. Whenever people bring up the idea that the United States doesn't have a cultus, I think that it does, and I think that the early founders, when talking about the United States and talking about going back to the colonial times, it was puritanical. It was with kind of a blend and a hint of this Anabaptist pluralism that was involved in that. But the idea that regardless of the clause that talks about religious freedom, that says you can't have any kind of religious test, right? Even in light of that, there was this understanding of America that it took a certain set of beliefs, it took a certain kind of worldview, what we would call now a worldview, in order to secure the world that's envisioned by these founders, and that's put into place, that is put into law constitutionally, that is philosophically the foundation of our freedoms, our liberties, our rights. And so I think that in generosity, I think it only fair to say that we do have a cultus, and we always have had a cultus. And it's shifted and morphed and changed, and people can talk about that. And I guess the last thing I would say is, when talking, I anticipate hearing more about secularization throughout the rest of the night. But when talking about secularization, I think that there's many different narratives regarding secularization. And I think that while I have some disagreements with Charles Taylor, I think his book, A Secular Age, does a really good job of describing the story, right? The history of how secularism took hold. And sometimes in discussions like these, it's easy to pin the tail on the donkey, right? But in some cases, I believe that some of the developments towards secularism happened as a consequence of otherwise good decisions made by pontiffs and made by the church, in eminentizing certain ascetical practices, for example, and expectations on the laity over time, that these were wise, and at the time even prudent, or in some cases necessary, but that these played a role in building in kind of this Hegelian dialectic, kind of creating a world, an interplay of the city of God and city of man, that resulted in secularism. And it's not as easy as just simply saying, liberals bad,
So
liberals did it.
Yeah, right. Right. So Kennedy, I want to give you, can you give me your take in 5 minutes, and I'll bring Gordon on in just a minute. Yeah, 5 minutes. Go ahead, Kennedy.
A couple things that stood out, even with the popes who flip-flopped in their matters of prudential action. Like, just for example, with the Action Française, concession by Pius XI.
Mm.
Even there, okay, the Action Française, it was not a Catholic organization. It was a French populist organization, which was very sympathetic to Catholicism, but it was what they would call traditionalist, which is basically like the way in Spanish they have tradicionalistas and stuff like this. It basically just means a movement towards the traditional cultural roots of a country. And G.K. Chesterton was actually quite, he would make fun of the traditional movements a little bit, because we would call traditional movements today something like conservative movements. But he made fun of it a little bit because he's thinking you're sort of idolizing the past that you rebelled against anyway. So there was a problem with this idea of just traditionalism. However, Pius XI made a prudential call where he said, listen, I can't remember the guy's name who was the head of the Action Française, but he wasn't a Catholic.
Yeah, he was an agnostic, right?
He was an agnostic, and we've seen what happens when deists and agnostics take over France. It sometimes results in people's heads getting cut off. So it wasn't as if there wasn't precedence for him saying, we should probably secure a specifically Catholic movement. Now, however, it does seem in Pius XI's life later on, he regretted his prudential decision against Action Française
Yeah,
because
Pius XII reversed it.
yeah,
too.
well, because it was really the only bulwark against impending outright socialism. But once again, it doesn't mean that his principles changed. It doesn't, and even with the popes before him, if they are conciliatory with this republic or that, it doesn't mean that their principles on liberalism change. But just like, you read in Aquinas, for example, you should allow, this is hypothetical he has in his works, but like you should allow maybe in a quarter of your city a place where morally illicit actions take place so they can be sort of quarantined. He's not saying let's go and promote prostitution. What he's saying is it's a reality. We're going to basically try to keep the peace, and a ruler is justified in taking prudential actions that work towards least amount of violence, common good, et cetera, et cetera. So right. Even if popes made different prudential decisions, I have no problem with that. I mean, and they could be wrong on those. I mean, it's like you made an error here, Holy Father, but you were right in how you were thinking about it. It just didn't work out with, all the moving parts. So that's one thing. And then secondly, as far as the Freemason thing goes, Freemasonry is diabolical. The only thing that the devil wants at the end of the day is for people to not be Catholic. So although you might have a Christian-friendly Freemasonry, it's not Catholic-friendly. So the American Freemasonic experiment definitely seems to be more of it doesn't seem to be a radically secularist, atheistic type that led to, the craziness in Europe. However, it's not Catholic. And when you do try to get a little too Catholic in the public sphere, you start to get the pushback, because Catholicism will always ask for the sovereign reign of Christ the King if it's really authentically done. So although the Freemasonry might be a little bit more lukewarm, I think the devil's happy as long as souls aren't Catholic and aren't encouraged to be so and can't fight for that. So I'm not trying to get too conspiratorial, but and also I would say with Leo XIII's commendation towards America, he's correct. America, generally speaking, is like the best, and I can say this as a Canadian. I can taste like vinegar coming out of my mouth a little bit, but but like America's great. America's awesome. It's all things considered. As far as like natural rights and all this kind of stuff, it's one of the best places you'll find. And Leo XIII is a pope, so therefore he's partly a statesman. And who was it? Pius IX, who sent was it General Lee, and he sent him a crown of thorns. Because he saw that there was basically a value in the Confederacy and the ideas that he had, and he thought he was almost being crucified. And so, I mean, there's an understanding of the beauty of the natural law principles as they might apply to the American experiment. But that's very different than saying that tolerable form of something like liberalism is reconcilable with Catholicism. Those are different things, in my opinion. And that's kind of where I'll end it.
Timothy Gordon is the author of Catholic Republic. He is one of the most well-known in the trad circles for making trads angry, because he upsets them with all of his historical points and philosophical arguments. So we wanted to have him on here today to give us the best defense we can, because if we want to discover anything, we do want to find out the best objections to anything, and look at every side of every issue. So trying to find the best defender of liberalism or the liberal order. So we're going to have John Zmirak will hopefully also join us maybe in a half hour. I don't know. We'll see about that. And then you got about 30 minutes, right?
Yeah,
Timothy?
yeah, 25, cool, 30. I just did a vid with go ahead.
Right on,
Sorry.
Right on, man. So break it down for us. Just give us the best points you got, just to I mean, you can kind of just distill your book, basically. Take it away.
Shoot. Well, first off, good to see all of you. It's exciting to be a proponent of Catholic Republicanism in this day and age. I'm completely against, I should start out by saying, a kind of shot across the bow, democracy, which is wicked. I'm against, as is the Catholic tradition of liberalism, which is strong, and Aristotle a little bit, before the fact. Thomas Aquinas, Cardinal Bellarmine, Pope Leo XIII, particularly if you've read Graves de Communi Rei or anything like it. completely against all forms of egalitarianism. That's what's really wicked. That's what really infected the waters at the French Revolution, was egalitarianism. And from time immemorial, Plato and Aristotle taught that democracy, wicked, making one man's vote, one man of a lower sort, his vote the equivalent of another man's vote, right? There's such a thing as a natural aristoi. And whether or not you're dealing with one of the three acceptable forms of government for Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Republicanism is one of those three good forms. You never would say that the natural aristoi, the virtuous kind of human being, doesn't matter. So Republicanism is built on the same basic structure of anti-egalitarianism, which is what monarchy is built on, which is what aristocracy is built on. They all presuppose a different sortedness of humankind, and that's really what all the basic first thought of all political governance and what all enculturation must be predicated on.
Awesome. Timothy, can you break down a little bit more for the listeners about the difference between democracy and republicanism that you're making in terms of the voting and the aristoi? Who are the aristoi? How do they function, and why is that anti-egalitarian?
Well, the last thing I want to do is be Straussian about it and give you an ancient answer and a modern answer, but I'm going to have to do that because the modern answer, which suffices, is that, democracy is direct representative rule. Republicanism is indirect representative rule, and it's actually adequate to the question, such as to serve the interrogative you're posing. And it's good. So America was founded, by the way, as a republic, 100% all the way. We've had all of these accretions to it, which were really deletions from it, which have made us more like some typical run-of-the-mill democracy, which is, presupposes that a great scholar with 2 PhDs, someone like, I don't know, Father Spitzer, his vote is worth the same as, homeless guy under the street. That's ridiculous. It's offensive. And it's relativistic. It's inherently relativistic. This cues up nicely the idea put forward about the ancient distinction between republic and a democracy, which is quite literally the Thomistic answer and the Aristotelian answer. They both take this cue from Plato, which is that there are these three acceptable forms of government: a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a polity, which is the other name for a republic, which are good. Each of them has a corrupted sort of darkling form, right, an inverse foil, if you will. And monarchies become tyrannies or despotisms. Aristocracies become oligarchies. Republics become democracies when they've become corrupted. So they become relativistic, and they're no longer predicated on the natural law, which made them. I mean, what is the basic unit of measurement for telling whether or not representative government, republic, is the most representative of the three good forms of government, whether or not it is hitting home? And the question is, are the representatives at law, whether they're direct or indirect, are they in a basic accord with the natural law? So the natural law is the most important of all 6 forms of government, good and bad. Good 3, bad 3. It's the most important for republics, and that's why when you read this book, it's all about the natural law, which is a completely perverted political creature, because it's been taken over by the Protestants with all the weird accretions that they put on pretty much everything they touch. And I mean, no offense, but so that's what we have. Republicanism is in the Catholic tradition, not the Protestant tradition. Yeah.
Okay. So what I hear you saying is that there is sort of still an aristocracy built into a republic, in the sense because they're electing the representatives. They're saying we need somebody who's a leader, who's virtuous, who has that sort of nobility in him. If it's not by blood, it's at least by merit. Like, we recognize him as following the natural law, he's a PhD or whatever. He's a worthy leader. We're going to elevate him. That type of thing. Is that what you're saying? Like, that's kind of the anti-egalitarian, whereas the democracy is like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, when you're using aristocracy in the generic sense, when you just mean power to the aristoi, the natural rule of the best, yeah, there is a kind of component of aristocracy and monarchy, proper specific aristocracy, the second good form of rule for Aristotle and St. Thomas, or republicanism. Yes, it's a yes with an if. Yeah.
All right. And so would you say that since 1776, you know, the world is a better place, or the good outweighs the bad, or you know, would you kind of form an apologetic for the Republican revolutionary history globally?
Certainly, I would say that in the antebellum period of the the American states, when you still capitalize the S, until the Civil War, yes, absolutely. The Civil War ruined all that. America stopped being a republic at the Civil War. When Lincoln, who was really I'm not talking about slavery itself, but Lincoln was a great tyrant. When he rolled up the state militias into the Coast Guard, and then 3 years after the Civil War ended, we got the 14th Amendment, the substitute for the Constitution. Yes, then all that stopped, and we basically started to be a democracy. But yes, things were beautiful, and they functioned as they were supposed to, constitutionally anyway, from the 1770s until the 1860s. Certainly.
Okay.
It's a strong case.
And one of the points I heard you make once was the importance of a republic being small. How does that fit into this? Is this like the subsidiarity with Lincoln exalting the federal government, and does that play into it becoming a democracy?
Certainly, all Republican theorists, from Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas through Cardinal Bellarmine, I could go through more obscure names, but through Montesquieu, who was really a classical thinker. He was educated for 12 years, from 8 to 20. He had a very Catholic mother at a classical academy called Jalili, and he was a classical thinker, even if he fell away from the church personally until his deathbed. All of them, best summarized by Montesquieu, had 3 cardinal rules of what it took to be a republic, such as not to be this corrupt sort of Leviathan regime that really is more a democracy than a republic. And it was 2 of those 3 rules are especially relevant to us today. One, if you like small government, if you like subsidiarity, it's a myth with a republic larger, in scare quotes, a republic larger than the size of like West Virginia, or maybe at largest Virginia, something like that. Because big land masses require big government. There are some real practical thought experiments we could use to show why that's always the case. 2, it goes hand in hand with that cardinal rule number 2 of real republics. The club has to be kept small, right? Any club that becomes too big for its own good sees outstripping of the raison d'etre for the club in the first place. I mean, if you want to keep a club pure, and that's what a republic is a club, really any of the 3 good political regimes, they have to be small enough to be pure, and therefore pluralism's a joke, right? And it's anti-republican. So you have to, and that's what a res publica is. Go read St. Augustine, who counts among the Republican theorists. A res publica means there has to be a fixed heart of the republic that no denizen of the republic could disagree about. And that's what the res publica is. And it's always a moral religious thing, like Roman Catholicism. So, and the third sine qua non for being a true republic is a more technical political thing we don't have to talk about. But I would say that in a post-Republican era, when we're really functioning as a democracy that calls itself a republic, we get in all these stupid debates with people calling themselves integralists or monarchists or whatever, where it's like, well, no, this isn't even what I'm talking about. Like, we're not a republic. We don't do it well. A continent-sized republic is a contradiction in terms. It's a circular square. So, and that is how Imperium and Imperio works. This is what was so damned interesting about the political theory of these Virginian geniuses in the 1780s. After the Articles of Confederation were kind of being illicitly gone away from, they were conceiving of this concept of Imperium and Imperio, where you still had states, which were like countries, that were united in a tighter format than a kind of United Nations, an empire within an empire. And the states, because the states were the true republics, they were doing all the adjudicating and legislating that mattered. And that's what you have in Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution, is a pale reflection of that. The federal legislative powers, these 16 or 17 things no one wants to do, they're utterly unsexy. The state legislatures have all the power to do everything. They have something called the police power from the 10th Amendment, the power to look after the health, safety, welfare, moral security, those 5 things of the states, all the sexy powers of the state legislatures. Well, Lincoln ruined all that. And slavery's bad. I'm saying that from the outset. But Lincoln ruined all that. He was a tyrant. He destroyed America.
Timothy, I know you got to go pretty soon. Do you want to make any more points before you go? You want to get any questions from these other gentlemen? What do you want to do?
Yeah. No, I got a couple minutes. I mean, liberalism's a good thing. Pope Leo XIII made this really, really clear. I mean, he's the 25-year pontificate and 85 encyclicals. Count them on 17 hands if you have them. By the many arms of Vishnu, you would need that many to count his encyclicals. And so he wrote tons of stuff. It's not just Rerum Novarum, which is great, but he loves liberalism because he's talking about it in the sense of the classical Republican theorists, which are deeply all Aristotomist. So yeah, I'd take any other questions. Sure.
Kennedy, what do you got?
Well, I agree.
Hello?
Oh, we got John. John's just joining us. Hey, John.
Hi. Just give me 1 second. I gotta give the.
Go ahead. We're just talking.
6.
Go ahead, Kennedy.
I agree. I think that a lot of the like silly debates is where you basically have a monarchist, Republican, etc. And it's almost as if they're trying to prove why their system can be retrofitted on a massive country, which is missing the point. And I heard you speaking on Marshall once, and you guys were talking about Catholic social teaching, and I agree that basically probably the most neglected and most important principle that we need now is subsidiarity. I find when I talk to, distributists, capitalists, whatever, pick your ist, when you're trying to talk to people on Twitter, etc. When you get down to the small sizes that countries really should be, if you're following a Catholic framework, things kind of have a lot of overlaps. So I agree with that there's a necessity for things to be a lot smaller. But just would you be able to define what you mean when you say Pope Leo was a fan of liberalism? Because he obviously did say things like liberals can be sons of Lucifer, and I know he's probably referring to the Masonic sects in those things. So can you distinguish between what you would call the French Revolutionary kind of bad liberalism, and then at the same time what we might call a true Aristotomist liberalism?
Sure. Yeah, it's an important question. I mean, there's nothing liberal about the French Revolution or any of the multiple Masonic revolutions which have marked the latter 200 years in the West. There's nothing liberal about them at all. They're all libertinistic,
right?
Which is the opposite of. I mean, look, we're not Calvinists. We're not Lutherans. We believe in a free will, right? And we're Aristotomists by moral philosophy. That's what we're committed to as Catholics. Aristotomists, I mean, Aristotle wrestles with this question in Book 5 of the Ethics, and he comes out in a way that probably surprised even himself. It's the question of whether or not, here's how we put it, is there such a thing as accidental virtue for Aristotle? And any, college undergrad that's taken the Nicomachean Ethics says yes. At best, that's what the perfunctory abidance of a moralish law does for you, is it gives you, it inculcates a natural, an accidental form of whatever virtue the law adjudicates. What this means is free will, even though Aristotle doesn't use the language of free will, he describes it perfectly. There are 4 levels, because it's all about virtue. That's what liberty is ultimately oriented at. And then that's what good law is ultimately all oriented at. But people hear me talk and they think I'm sounding like a legal positivist who says that morality and legality should be divorced. It's absurd. It's just Aristotelianism is marked by a sort of deeper level where you have to look at the distinctions he's making. There's pure vice, which in Aristotle is pure vice is marked by the test is always pleasure or pain. So you do the wrong thing, and you're not pained by it even a little. You have pure pleasure, and most of the time this is just from ignorance, but it can be from something other than ignorance. You can know. The next level is what Aristotle and Thomas call incontinence or unrestraint, where you do the wrong thing still. You still give in to whatever vice is at issue, but you're pained by the fact that you're not giving your money to charity the way you saw someone do it. So you're not getting pure pleasure anymore from the thing. Incontinence or unrestraint. You know what you ought to be doing, and you know that it's going to pain you and it's bad for you, but you do it anyway. On the flip side of just once you start doing the right thing, and this is a political question, once you start doing the right thing, it's called continence, right? Or restraint, where you're doing the right thing, but you're doing the right thing for the wrong reason, or mainly just because you kind of know by rote, this is what I ought to do, but you're still pained by it. It's not true virtue for Aristotle and Thomas until you reach that fourth level, and you only march upward through the realms by habituation. By doing the right thing enough times to now you do the right thing and you're pleased by it. You actually experience endorphin rush in your brain from giving to the poor. So laws cannot, while good laws are oriented to the common good and all that, definitely for Aristotle and Thomas, laws can only bring you at most to continence.
Right.
So the realm for liberty, free will, we're not Calvinists, we're not Lutherans, laws must be minimalistic, and this is what we mean by liberty. We don't want a regime that purports to get us all the way to virtue when the most it can do is get us to continence, because that's the most the law can do anyway. So we don't want to stretch the coercive power, capacity, or abilities of the law.
Fair enough.
I would say, John Zmirak here, I would say we also don't want the law to violate people's freedom of conscience. We don't want laws based on divine revelation. We want laws based on natural law, that you can make a public appeal to things that are commonly accepted by anyone who believes in God and the immortality of the soul. I would say natural law is the only appropriate basis for coercive public law. So you could have a Catholic monarchy like Austria-Hungary in the 19th century, and it allowed religious freedom for Protestants and Jews. It still was officially Catholic and had Catholic holidays, and the emperor was crowned by the archbishop. Those weren't coercive laws. They weren't doing what Louis XIV did in France, which was taking Protestant children away from their parents and sending them to Catholics to be raised for the sake of their eternal salvation. That's an example of the state overreaching its rightful boundaries and violating the sacred realm of the liberty of conscience. And I would say, if you want to call that liberalism, call it whatever you want. It is the respect for the human person that we as Christians should have. And I find the integralists tend to have a utopian vision that they can use the coercive power of the state to impose true orthodox theology on everyone, regardless of their consciences, and that somehow God will honor this and this will work out better in the long run. I'll point out that pretty much every country that had an integralist style system gave way to a vicious anti-clerical persecution of the church a few generations later. The persecution of the Huguenots, I think, is one of the root causes of the French Revolution. The excessive powers of the church in Mexico probably laid the groundwork for the anti-clerical revolution there. The same in Spain. We've never had a vicious persecution of the church in the United States. I find Catholics saying, well, in 1848, there was one riot. They used to have no Irish need to apply signs in a few restaurants. I mean, no, we were never persecuted here. And by the way, when people talk about the anti-Catholicism of America, I would point out that at the same time in Catholic Spain and in the Papal States and Mexico, Protestant churches were illegal. You couldn't have one. You had to have it in your house and it had to be hidden away. So, I mean, I cut slack to the American founders for their supposed anti-Catholicism. Let me say something about John Locke. People, I hear anti-liberals.
John, I'm just gonna.
Yeah.
John, I'm gonna cut you off just a second. Timothy has to go.
Okay.
You want to check out Timothy Gordon and his brother David Gordon.
I wanted to ask him a
channel is called-
question. This is Tim.
Oh, Jeremiah.
You're
You
gonna
guys
tell
take
me
time, Timothy?
of
Jeremiah.
all the time,
Okay,
of
go
all
ahead,
the
Jeremiah.
people. It would absolutely destroy me. It'd break my heart if I wasn't able to talk to Mr. Gordon. Yeah, this is Jeremiah.
You got it, man. Hey, what's up,
I
Jeremiah?
do. I got you,
Yeah.
buddy. So, okay, hey, look. I wanted to ask you when you bring up Leo XIII and how much he loved he loved liberty and everything else. Well, he wrote about it, and one of the things as I've prepared for this, I listened actually to, I think it's John Pinero, the professor of history and the founding director of Catholic Studies at Aquinas College. Also, other people from the Acton Institute, when talking about the issue of liberty in the church throughout history. And each time when it comes back to libertas and it comes back to the treatment of freedom of speech, right? Freedom of press, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, even freedom of association, that you're able to gather together with different belief structures and everything else, that they were critical of these things. And the answer has always kind of been, well, they didn't really understand it. They didn't really understand, like, for example, in the it was just a video I was watching just today, in fact, called "Is Catholicism at Odds with the American Experiment?" It's over at the Acton Institute. People can listen to it. It's part of their Acton line. And when asked about this, it was kind of the same thing. It was, well, they didn't really understand it, and the specific instance brought up had to do with freedom of the press, and how he said, well, believe it or not, people used to burn books. And I'm like, well, they did in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the book of Acts. That was one of the things that the apostles did, in fact. But that he brings up specifically, and I got to give him credit for this, that he said when people, the popes were critical of this idea that, if we allowed for everybody to publish what they wanted to publish, if they were all just free to do that some good would come of it. And he said the popes are critical of that. And the end was, well, they just didn't understand it yet. And I'm just wondering, why is it? Because that seems to be a matter of the philosophical principle at play that is the source of their criticism, that it's not just simply, well, we're looking at the fallout here, but they're saying in principle, and they fall back on Augustine and other things that say this is a lopsided way of looking at what should be done and what is right. And I guess I'm curious, how do you respond to people when they bring this kind of thing up, when they bring up the criticisms of the various liberties that are common in the network or web that we call liberalism? How would you respond to them that it's not a matter of principle that the popes were in disagreement with, but that it was something that is able to, in fact, be reversed or changed?
Well, your problem is the language. You're using language equivocally. Well, you're using a pros hen equivocal, to borrow Aristotle's term. Like, liberalism is a term that's been bastardized. I came right out of the gate and said it's been bastardized. What as a matter, and you're also, I think, I don't know what documents you're even quoting from, because I'm telling you, read 6 or 7 of the encyclicals of Pope Leo XIII. Everywhere he's praising liberty. Liberty of the press can mean anything from a reporter yelling fire in a crowded building, which of course is proscribed by the Constitution. There are like 6 forms of speech I could think of right now: sedition, certain types of pornography, perjury, that are not protected as a class of protected speech, and never have been. In 1800 or 1799, we had the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were passed, under the second presidency of the United States, where they were literally more strict than things you or I wouldn't complain about passing muster as free speech now. Under the John Adams presidency, when all this stuff was fresh and unbastardized. So what you'd have to do is point at something that's not dicta, mere dicta in a papal encyclical and show me, because if that's the Acton answer, then that's just the wrong way of defending the principle. The principle is not that they didn't understand anything; they understood better than we do. Can you point me to some place, because I know of none, where any pope has ever said liberty writ large, political liberty is bad, right? It's there in
No.
I mean, aside from Calvin, I've never seen that. Freedom of the press, in the sense of the press being able to go and interview heads of state, which is really all it means. That's part of the First Amendment. That's good. Here's one thing. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, written and ratified 3 years after the Constitution, is a kind of promise by the Federalists to the Anti-Federalists, who didn't want the Constitution ratified without a precedent Bill of Rights. 3 years afterwards, the Federalists made good on this promise to have a Bill of Rights. You're talking about things that get talked about in the kind of sort of crass, obtuse political badinage between left and right. Everyone's for freedom of press. I think you, me, in the sense that the Catholic popes would extol it. Like the First Amendment, when we talk about separation of church and state, this is another one of the big ones that stick in a lot of people's craw. There's no need for it until 1946 Supreme Court case, which self-consciously reversed the meaning of the First Amendment, the quote-unquote two religion clauses there, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. They literally, we had 8 of 13 states under the First Amendment that had official establishments of religion, like state establishments, until the antebellum period expired, up to the Civil War. So the First Amendment doesn't mean what people think it means about integralism. We had integralism under the First Amendment until the Masons on the bench, or 7 of 9 Masons, sitting justices in 1946, self-consciously reversed the meaning of the free establishment and the establishment and the free exercise clauses. They really reversed the meaning, or at least perverted what we conceive of as free press, right? It doesn't stand for pornography. We had strict sedition laws, stricter in the 1790s than we would recognize today. There's no tension. That's the only real answer to the question. If Acton is saying that, who I largely agree with about most of these matters, and they're not giving a good defense.
Well, I'm not arguing the idea. Let me be very cautious with this. Is that it was somebody that was being interviewed on a podcast found at the Acton YouTube page. But just for clarity, and not to get into a debate over it, I know your time's limited. But paragraph 23 in Leo's encyclical on liberty, when he begins, and you don't even have to read the whole paragraph, but just, we must now consider briefly liberty of speech and liberty of press. It's hardly necessary to say that there can be no such right as this, if it be not used in moderation, and if it pass beyond the bounds and end of all true liberty. And he goes on to talk about,
there you go.
Men have a right freely and prudently to propagate throughout the state, but he says that this doesn't apply to things that are false opinions. And the question would then arise: how do you determine this? I mean, in the American scheme, insofar as I'm aware, and maybe you can correct me,
and
but
I just want to. I'm sorry. I want to cut in here, John. I want to give you time before you have to go.
Thanks.
But before Timothy, do you want to say anything else real quick before we let John speak?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thanks for having me on. I've appreciated it. Book Rules for Retrogrades comes out tomorrow. This is the book I think, Tim, that you wanted to have me on for. Jeremiah, good question. I would just say, literally, without my tongue planted in my cheek, question asked, question answered on that Leo quote on Libertas, because there's a big if in the middle of that statement, and what he's essentially saying is A is only A if it's not A prime, right? So he said, if liberty of speech, so-called, transcends and transgresses the bounds of what we would call proper liberty of speech, then it's not really actually liberty. This is how he always uses an intrinsic argument, a definitional argument, to defend liberty. The people, and he's also defending against the most revolutionary century in the history of mankind, when lots of French revolutionary wannabes were calling freedom of speech something that's not freedom of speech. So I'd say the big if is the answer to the question.
All right, cool. Thank you, Timothy. I appreciate you coming on. So everybody check out Rules for Retrogrades. The book is coming out tomorrow. The channel is there, also YouTube channel. Checking him out with his brother David. So thanks, Timothy. And we don't you're not here for the whole conversation, so feel free to watch the whole video if you want to provide any further answers, to any critiques that get flown around. We want everybody to be heard. So thanks, Timothy.
When's it coming out,
brother?
Yeah, sure. Thank
we're
you.
going to premiere it tomorrow. So it's it'll be 9 a.m. Pacific time tomorrow.
All right, this is fun. I wish I had more time. This is the third show I've done.
Another time, brother.
Yeah.
Right on,
okay.
Man.
God bless you guys.
God bless.
I'll come around tomorrow.
Right on, man.
See you later, John. Bye, Jeremiah. Bye, Tim. Peace.
Hey, see you later. Yes.
So, John,
Yes.
Go ahead, and I'm sure you have a lot to say, and limited time. Go right ahead.
Sure. I'll stipulate that Leo XIII sounds like he wanted the state to ban books with what he considered false opinions, for instance, Protestant tracts. And I would just say he was wrong. And it was not an infallible document, and I do not feel bound by it. Popes have been on different sides of political issues over the centuries, on slavery, on lending it interest, on torture, on capital punishment. If you look at my article at the Catholic Thing, The Myth of Catholic Social Teaching, I would recommend people take a look at it. The idea that there is a social magisterium, that the popes in their opinions that they have issued in encyclicals are binding doctrinally on us, that their analyses of natural law are binding on us like articles of faith. This is a myth. This is not true. You simply cannot reconcile every political opinion or application of natural law offered by popes over the centuries with each other, religious liberty being the most obvious one. There is no reconciling what the 19th century popes said about religious liberty with what Vatican II and the popes who interpreted it afterwards said about religious liberty. There is a rupture there. And we, I think, have to use our consciences to discern which of those is correct. I'm not saying the new teaching is infallible either. I think the very fact that there is this disjunction means that this is in the realm of liberty, in the realm for us to discern and try to determine which one is true, using our reason and reflecting on natural law and the gospel.
It could also just mean that the modern popes are wrong.
Yeah.
And
they could be.
But if we follow them, that's a grave error, because
just because one pope said it before the other pope doesn't mean the second pope is wrong. They have equal authority. And what
if like 6 or 7 or 8 popes say it before the one pope?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of mathematics. I think if you could probably count more popes who approved of slavery than those who disapproved of it. I don't think that convinces anything. Certainly Pius IX, as late as 1859, I believe, his holy office said there was nothing intrinsically evil about chattel slavery. And that 1859. Read what the Catechism says today.
The Catechism that changes all the time?
Hey, if you want to say that there's no pope, or that the popes since Vatican II have no authority, or that the church has all apostatized and we haven't had a real pope since 58 or 64 or 1967, pick a date, fine, but you're not exactly filling people with confidence in the idea that, oh, well, we must make Catholicism the official religion of the state and not tolerate other religions. Of course, they can't get their act together, and they have absolutely no idea who's in charge or what they believe. But, hey, let's let them arrest heretics.
Well, let me
pretty big leaps there, but okay.
Well, hold on a second.
Right,
John,
yeah.
John, you got 5 more minutes or so, 10 more minutes with us?
Yeah.
Can you give us, I want to give you this time. You can take it how you like. If you want to just make a statement, I'm particularly interested in your critiques of the old order prior to 1776. What was wrong about it? Why was the Republican Revolutionary Global Movement necessary? If you could speak more to that point.
Sure.
I think Gordon didn't get much into that part.
Sure.
You want to go into that or go wherever you'd like to. I'm going to give you time if you want to take any questions too. Go ahead.
I'd say, first of all, I agree with Russell Kirk that the American revolutionaries were actually reactionaries. they were asserting liberties that had grown up in the Middle Ages, that were part of Teutonic culture, that you saw living on in Switzerland and some of the Italian republics. They were asserting decentralism, the limits on the power of the king, the rights of the citizen over against the state. These were medieval things that were actually part of the medieval Catholic order that were gradually torn away with the rise of absolute monarchies. Think about it, by 1789, the King of France was appointing all the bishops in France. The King of Spain was appointing all the bishops in Spain. Philip II was able to prevent the publication of the Council of Trent for 70 years because he didn't approve of its contents. The church had not really had its liberty since the Reformation, even in Catholic countries, because those Catholic countries all looked at Henry VIII. And they all said, well, they basically told the popes at various times, we can do a Henry VIII and take over the church directly and run it without you, or you can essentially cede us state control over the church. And the culmination of this was the suppression of the Jesuits. Catholic monarchs of Portugal and Spain went to the Pope and demanded he suppress the Jesuits because they considered the Jesuits too liberal, in the sense that Jesuits said you could resist a tyrannical king. Jesuits following Thomas said you could overthrow a tyrannical government. Jesuits were loyal to Rome and not to the king, and the Pope was forced to do it. Very interestingly, in a great book by my friend Sam Gregg, Tea Party Catholic, he points out that when the United States had been founded, the Vatican wanted to appoint a bishop for Baltimore, like a presiding bishop of the United States. And they wrote the U.S. Congress asking for permission, because in every one of those Catholic countries in Europe, they had to get the government's approval over appointing a bishop and who it was. And I don't remember which American official wrote back and said, we have no say in this. You do what you wish. This was the freest place for Catholics in the world because the Pope could actually pick the bishop. So I would say that the American revolutionaries, while they were dogged Calvinist Protestants, through an irony of history that Russell Kirk unfolds in his book, America's British Culture, and also The Roots of American Order, the religious turmoil in England caused England to retain more traditional liberties in Britain than existed on most of the continent, except in places like Switzerland and Venice. These were the things that these Protestants latched onto to defend their religious freedom against the Anglicans. So by an irony of history, the Anglo-American tradition retains more aspects of the medieval Catholic order, subsidiarity, liberty, resistance to central authority, than most Catholic countries that had turned into autocracies by the time of the Revolution. So that's what I think we as American Catholics should be digging into and exploring and making use of, and trying to convince people to order our laws according to the natural law and to use our freedom wisely and responsibly. And this should be our focus rather than Ignatius Reilly fantasies of an intolerant Catholic state.
Do you think that, like, I guess on a scale from naughty to, oh my gosh, you're going to burn in hell for this, where would you place the popes that, for example, Pius XI, when he wrote that the church has not only the right to speak on these issues and that it's exercising the divine teaching office entrusted to them, but goes on further and says that those who hold this encyclical in little esteem, right, and its commemoration either blaspheme what they know not or understand nothing of what they are only superficially acquainted with, or if they do understand, convict themselves formally of injustice and ingratitude. Statements like that.
I say he's pounding on the table.
The Pope?
Yeah, the Pope is pounding on the table. Yeah. This Pope is pounded on the table. This Pope's Vatican teaches us that communist China is the highest embodiment of Catholic social teaching. So no, I'm not that impressed when a Pope pounds on the table. It's not an infallible document. So
they say
teaches that I have to follow his fallible document. That's the definition of bootstrapping.
If they say that I guess it would be an interesting thing if you have a number of popes, as we do, it seems like you grant this. You just say it's that they're wrong. The idea that, yep, okay. The idea that it's within not only their right to talk about it, and it's a valid thing because of their competence, authority, and jurisdiction, that it's under moral law. If they write about this and you have a consecutive number of them, let's say, I don't know, for 100-something years, that consecutively insist upon the exact same idea, that they have authority, competency, and jurisdiction, and that these are matters of moral theology, right, and moral law. If we can't trust that with that kind of a precedent, is there anything else? I mean, what else would that possibly affect with even the trust of everyday people? 'Cause, I mean, it seems pretty bad. I mean, that would seem like if they're wrong about that and they're talking this way, saying that people are blaspheming, I mean, that seems to touch on faith and morality.
That's a matter of
faith.
I
mean, it does seem that it at least seems that way.
Infallibility here. I'm sorry, none of those documents are infallible. Piling up 10 of them on top of each other doesn't make any one of them infallible.
Do you know?
So you must not really accept Vatican II then, Because it's not infallible either.
I don't say Vatican II is infallible. I never said it was.
Okay.
I'm saying
that. So what do you listen to? Like the two infallible statements since like 1850?
I would say infallible statements of councils and popes, and if there are teachings that no pope or council since the age of the apostles has ever contradicted. So, for instance, the teaching on capital punishment would have been at that level up until this pope. Unfortunately, this pope throws it back open. I personally think the scriptural argument is decisive that the death penalty is right. But I would not, in other words, I think the way to describe the ordinary magisterium is that which there has been a consensus of popes and councils going back to the apostles. And if there hasn't been a consensus, then it's open for debate and argument. There is a correct position, but it's not an infallible one. So,
okay, John, do you want to take any more time just making any more points or anything?
I would just like to say, if people want to know more about this,
go ahead.
Look at my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Catholicism, or follow me at stream.org, where I frequently write about these things. Thanks, guys. Have a great night.
Awesome. Thanks, John.
Thanks. You too.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. The only problem with having guests briefly. The only problem with having guests only here for 30 minutes is that they can't defend themselves if anyone criticizes them after they leave. So, John and Timothy, if you are watching this recording right now on YouTube, understand that we want to hear your answers. If Kennedy or Jeremiah or anybody provides any critiques to what you just said, we want to hear your answers to that, and we want to give you space to also answer that. So, it's kind of unfair if we take somebody out of the conversation and then we criticize them. So please provide all of your critiques or whatever answers. Hopefully we can have John or Timothy or both back on for a more lengthy discussion. This was kind of impromptu because I was planning to defend liberalism, but I think that there are better defenders of liberalism than myself. So I was happy to have John and Timothy on us. So thank you, John and Timothy, for coming on. Let's see, Kennedy, why don't you go first? And we wanted to sort of start with the history and then kind of have a defense of liberalism. So that's the time that we had to sort of defend liberalism, give the best defense we can. And so, Kennedy, can you provide your critique of liberalism? Go ahead.
Well, yeah, and there's just a lot of things I wrote down as John was speaking. First, actually, I should say, I think Tim Gordon is a really great mind. I don't know if I disagree with him, to be honest, because he's so convincing. But in my sort of gut, I am a monarchist, okay? But when I hear him talk about a Republican regime, it sounds pretty much like what I envision in my head, but just with some minutia that's different. I think that he's got an extremely sound Catholic mind, and his thinking on the matter is very correct in my opinion. And his legal precedent with what his law background is way above my head, so I would never want to debate him on the topic. But I think Tim Gordon is awesome. Okay, but there's a few things I'd like some evidence. John was talking about, he said that the French Revolution was probably a result of the Huguenots being persecuted. we're missing the fact that there was like massive famines, that the French were in the 100 Years' War, or the 7 Years' War, was 100 or 7 Years' War. Anyway, they're fighting here in Canada in the Plains of Abraham versus the British. They're extended all over the earth, and they're fighting with the Americans against the British on the mainland here. There's the major potato famine that affected Ireland and basically northwestern France, where the potato production was from. The king basically bankrupted himself trying to feed his population, and then a bunch of, I don't know, libertines and pseudo-communists sort of took over the country by chopping everybody's heads off. So I don't really know if that's just because of the persecution of the Huguenots. The allusion to bad monarchs, whenever, and Timothy Gordon did not do this, but the allusion to bad monarchs is just dumb in my opinion. There's this guy who lives on Earth, and he lives in this big White House in Washington, D.C., and with the stroke of a pen, he can basically tell nuns they have to take birth control or sell it or whatever the heck they had to do. And he can, it's like, thank goodness we don't have a king. It's like, give me a break. The functions of the average democratic ruler today are almost, not even Henry VIII could do with the swipe of a pen what Barack Obama could do with, picking up a phone. Okay, so that's ridiculous. There were so many leaps. Historical, this led to this, and I don't even know where to start with that. It's impossible to argue that because it's like this wide sweeping view of history that has no precedent. Basically called me a sedevacantist, but then at the same time basically himself denied anything that any pope has ever written except for like 2 documents. That's kind of ironic. Liberty of conscience has been condemned like 1 billion times by popes, and not 1 billion, but probably just 500 million. And people don't understand how the tradition works. I'm not going to give a huge overview here, but people should listen to a series by Father Ripperger. It's called basically Catholic Tradition. There's a way, and actually my priest at Mass tonight was telling us this. There's a way that we can know God's will. Basically, if it's part of the tradition, meaning it's part of the general sensus fidelium, the consensus which John was appealing to in some fashion, although erroneously, over time. Okay, and if it is part of the general Catholic tradition and leads to good fruits, is reconcilable with the great scholars, if the theologians agree, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, you find this with the condemnation of freedom of conscience, and you really find it with the condemnation of freedom of worship. And I won't go through it all here, but I have Lefebvre's book here. They've uncrowned him. And I've got Pius VII with quod aliquantulum. I've got Pius VII with Postan Diortinatis. Sorry, my Latin's bad there. Gregory XVI with Mirarivos. Pius IX with Quanta Cura. Pius IX with the Syllabus of Errors. Literally in the Syllabus of Errors, he says one of the errors is that the Roman pontiff ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress and liberalism. Well, that's an error. The other idea is that in the present day, it is no longer expedient that the Catholic religion should be held as the only religion of the state. So the idea, so to the exclusion of all other forms of worship. So it's an error to say, according to Blessed Pope Pius IX, it's an error to say, according to him, in line with all of the precedent that came before him, it's an error to say that the Catholic religion should not be the only religion of the state in an official sense. We can have tolerance, of course. And that it's also an error to say that you shouldn't exclude the other forms. So not only in the tradition of the church should the Catholic faith be the capital THE religion of the state, it should also, and has precedent, to exclude other forms. Now, and I actually have the working documents here that were ripped up at the Second Vatican Council, but leading up to the documents for religious liberty, etc. There's obviously room for tolerance. Of course, we don't coerce anyone to be Catholic. That would take away the free will, assent to faith, etc. Also, they keep talking about Tim did talk about the natural law, but Tim qualified what he meant by the natural law, and I would imagine that Tim would give a great defense of how you could find that without necessarily having to be specifically Catholic. I'm imagining he would use Aristotle and do an amazing job on the matter. But the natural law, okay, when people say we have to have the natural law according to who? It's not enough to just say the natural law. If you read through Voltaire, he gives you his example of the natural law, right? It's not really correct, but it's natural and it's to him. You can read through various philosophers and look at and also this allusion to slavery. Pope was a Blessed Pope Pius IX. He said chattel slavery was fine. I'm pretty sure that that's not true in the way that he's saying it. What various popes have done since the advent of modern slavery, which is very different than ancient slavery. In all ancient cultures, virtually everybody was a slave because there was no such thing as sort of fiat Keynesian economics where you're going to have increases in wealth. So if you didn't have resources, you didn't have stuff. And that's a whole different thing. Basically, slavery was a way of life. Now, with this whole chattel slavery, Blessed Pope Pius IX, he sent a crown of thorns, like I said earlier in the show, to I believe it was General Lee. I can't remember.
Jefferson Davis.
That's right. That's right.
President of the Confederate States of America.
That's right. My Canadian inadequate historical education is failing me here. But because he saw that just like when a pope makes a prudential decision on, hey, you guys are Catholics, you're being persecuted by some Freemasonic whatever, but you still don't have the right to rebel in this sense because it won't be a just rebellion because there's too much violence. The civilians will get killed, whatever. It's not commensurate with the threat that you're under, basically. Okay. In the same way, he saw the grave problems with what would happen with the sort of immediate ending of the slave trade as such, because it was an entire world economy that was facilitating Atlantic trade, etc. And it was a big problem, and it really has been a disaster ever since with how it was dealt with. So he was basically asking for prudence in the matter. He didn't approve of it, saying, hey, I'm the Pope. The gospel says go and get a bunch of people from Africa and treat them poorly. Like, that's ridiculous to suggest that. So that's enough of my rant for now.
All right. Jeremiah. I want one point. I do want to point out. I think that John made very well, because I'm going to try to defend liberalism for the rest of the show, just to be balanced here. I think John did make a very good point about the absolutist monarchs and the type of abuse of authority was present with these Catholic monarchs. Like, he talked about suppression of the Jesuits, because the Jesuits at that time, that was back when the Jesuits were great. They were converting natives, they were preaching the gospel, they were helping people out of poverty, they were doing all these great things. And but all these monarchs wanted to just enslave the natives. So it was this constant war between these men of God in general, obviously, men of God preaching the gospel, and these slave masters who want to just enslave everybody. And you just have the wealth of these nations, the absolutist monarchs, who are just basically just they're reincarnating the old pagan emperors, where they're basically quasi gods, because they're just Louis XVI, I think, was the one who said, I am the state, this type of mentality. So I think he is right to condemn. I think this is a really good point, because that period was basically just Henry VIII being replicated in other Catholic monarchs as well, which is just this absolutist total tyranny, basically. And so I agree absolutely with that understanding that as a wrong, as a corruption of the medieval monarchs, the feudalism, the limited monarchs who had very little power comparatively, to these absolute monarchs who still are not as much as Obama or Trump, not even close, killing somebody by a drone strike by fiat, whatever. But still a grave abuse of the rights of the citizens. And so I think I agree, at least in principle, with the concept of some sort of revolution or some sort of reformation, in those good senses, at least, of the word, to try to correct the situation. So I want to say, I think we could all agree on that point, because I think there is that abuse of the tyranny. But I want to give Jeremiah some time to give his thoughts. Go ahead, Jeremiah.
Well, I wanted to say, first of all, Timothy Gordon is a brilliant guy, right? Mad respect for him. And actually, like I said on the video that I made critical of him, I actually agree with him on a great number of things, and I'm not as opposed to him as many people may think, especially when it comes to republics and the United States and free markets, right? I have a lot of sympathy and even belief in those things. And so that's just right out of the gate. But I do want to say, when I asked him the question pertaining to statements that were made by popes that really cut to the core of the criticism against liberalism. It wasn't just simply, we haven't learned the policy yet, or we haven't seen how it plays itself out, or the bang for the buck, but that it really went to the core principles within the positions maintained by liberals that was the criticism. For example, if you go back in Morari Vos again, when talking about when you go and you talk about liberty of conscience, the position of the popes was that liberty of conscience was an after effect of indifferentism, not that it was a result of not that indifferentism was a result of the liberty of conscience. And it says that it spreads ruin in sacred and civil affairs through though some repeat over and over again with the greatest impudence that some advantage accrues to religion from it. Well, that is what is being said by liberal people. That is what is being said, that, well, we can see the advantage from it, that there is some kind of thing, a great, we're free. Yes, true. There's been this rampant, terrible thing that's happened with society and the way that people just have gone in all different directions with beliefs and everything else and what they publish. And that's yet another thing, the idea of being free to publish. Again, Morari Vos, saying, we are horrified to see what monstrous doctrines and prodigious errors are disseminated far and wide in countless books, pamphlets, and other writings, which, though small in weight, are very great in malice. We are in tears at the abuse which proceeds from them over the face of the earth. Every law condemns deliberately doing evil simply because there is some hope that good may result. He said, is there any sane man? Is there any sane man who would say poison ought to be distributed, sold publicly, stored, and even drunk because some antidote is available and those who use it may be snatched from death again and again? And then he goes,
Jeremiah.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. You got one more? Oh, okay.
Well, yeah. The last part of this, where he says the church has always taken action to destroy the plague of bad books. This was true even in apostolic times, for we read that the apostles themselves burned a large number of books. True.
But wouldn't you say, Jeremiah, wouldn't you agree with Timothy when he says that the foundation of virtue is freedom? Meaning the free will, the free choice to choose to do the good. Shouldn't we increase more freedom so that people can be more virtuous, to be able, so like he was saying, like the state cannot try to get you to this higher virtuous level. It can only do this limited amount. So we should give people the freedom so that they can be virtuous. If they're not free, they can't be virtuous. How do you respond to that?
Well, this is what I was saying. It's really down to a debate about the limitations. And I think that it's not that the state is using active means to make one virtuous, but that there are mechanisms in place to prohibit them from being out of control, maniacal, diabolical people, right? That there's a way of saying that, one is free to believe what one believes, but one is not in regards to the state, right? In regards to God, of course not, right? You can't, no one's going to stand before God and say, well, I was free. I lived up my freedom. They're still going to be held to account for that. But insofar as the state is concerned, even if someone said, well, you're free to believe in this, right? You take the Old Testament. In the Old Testament case law, you had it so that people were free, for example, to believe in different gods, but they couldn't have the idols out in public.
Right.
They couldn't have their congregations all together and do their sacrifices out in public. That was forbidden. Right. And same thing with going around and talking things that were blasphemous, forbidden. And I don't know anyone who would say that was a bad, like the idea of coming against the Mosaic law and saying that, well, that was just grotesquely unjust. The idea of that is a real difficult one, especially because Moses specifically talks about nations all around that will look upon the law and say not only how just and how righteous all of their statutes are, but that there's no nation with a God that's given such justice and freedoms to these people and order to them, and that it would be the envy of the surrounding nations. And I would contest that would be even in time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Jeremiah, bringing it back to the Holy Scripture, because there is no precedent. And this is the thing that I think is a difficult, and I wonder what John would say about this, because to me, I think this is a difficulty for liberalism because, like John was saying, he was saying I would agree with a consensus, but I mean, I can't find a precedent for a secular liberal state before 1776. Like we go back to Moses right there. You know, if this is according to the natural law, if the very foundation of natural law is this freedom of conscience, why do you have God himself proclaiming this, there's no separation of church and state, so to speak, in this Mosaic law? But I wanted to point out one thing that you said I thought was a good point too, which was the state is not coercing virtue, it's rather limiting the extremes of evil, basically. And I think that's where we bring it back to pornography, because Marquis de Sade introduces pornography as a form of political control during the French Revolution. And today, pornography is an international billion-dollar industry where more people voted on Pornhub than the last presidential election in America. Yeah, and gross. So this is a massive octopus which has enveloped the world with all its tentacles, which is this plague of pornography, which I think that's the other very difficult hurdle for the liberals, I think, because how do you deal with that in a liberal state? How do you deal with this plague of pornography?
I don't think you can. Like, I mean, in Tim Gordon's idea, I think you could, because once again, he, and I agree with him, talks about the necessity of a very small state. I mean, he kept using the term aristoi. So, I mean, there's not really voting in the way we see it, but there's more of a representative. I would imagine in a Catholic confessional state that would include clergy, that would include Catholic scholars, that would include folks with skin in the game as far as the church is concerned. So the laws would have to reflect that. I guess you could say in that kind of republican state, if the church is still the confessional church, then you could have basically the threat of, well, not the threat, but the reality of the fact that people actually believe the teachings, and therefore, like, public displays of mortal sin are condemned, and people aren't allowed to celebrate, to receive communion, things like that. I mean, there is a way that you could have real legitimate censors on certain behavior because the state requires deference towards the confessional church. I think that's possible. But I don't know. I find it a little bit lacking when the sort of liberal-minded, and I'm not saying Tim Gordon would do this, but I find it a little bit lacking when the liberal-minded folks would say, well, the state shouldn't even really technically ban pornography. And this is one of the reasons why in my gut, I sort of go back to monarchy. It's just because if I look at things on the smallest level, like there's just lots of things I forbid my children from doing. And I don't really care what they think about their freedom when it comes to watching immoral content, because I care more about their soul than they do right now, because they don't even understand that because they're so little, I think in the liberal mindset of looking at government, they're missing the idea that there is a fatherly role that has to be portrayed through the leadership, which in good monarchy and traditionally, and we should say too, the abuses in monarchy, the sort of divine right of kings, it really is a Protestant idea. So we shouldn't even really include it. Like the Catholic kings who were Henry VIII-ish, they were aberrations and they were bad Catholic kings, right? They don't really represent the Catholic monarchy tradition in the truest sense of the word. So I don't know how you deal with it. I think that's why, like, even if I was going to assent to something like a republic, I would still, in my, I'd almost want to have almost like a veto power from, I don't know, the catechism or the Pope or something, where you could say, hey, you can't pass this law because you'll excommunicate yourself from the church if you do so. It's something like that, if that makes sense. I don't know how I'm just trying to find out how you could do that in a liberal society. And I think it'd be pretty tough.
Yeah. And I think that the liberal answer to some of what you're saying here, like the fatherly role, is to say that the citizenry are not children. They're adults. They are, trying to be virtuous men and women. And so there is that John in one of his articles used, I think the term he used was paternalistic in sort of a pejorative sense, where the state is just sort of this pagan dictator, autocrat, tyrant that's just telling everybody what to do. And so that's the sort of he's talking about the exalted dignity of the human person that has the rational capacity to become virtuous, which that is absolutely dogma in terms of every rational soul is called to be virtuous and become holy and go to eternal life. And so there is a sense where one can also say, on the contrary, we're not children. But I wanted to get to what, in my opinion, I think maybe the best argument for liberalism to me is the alleviation of poverty, the increase of wealth in the hands of more and more people. Like you said, in ancient times, slavery was a way of life. That was basically the economy, was just a bunch of elites and most people were slaves. That's just the way of life. Like I said, you can go back and watch some of those history videos that I made about some of the feudalism and the way that the slaves became serfs and peasants and how that changed. And so there was an amelioration to an extent, but with the free market as a very free, laissez-faire. And what I mean by that for listeners, just like that quote that I've said in the very beginning, where he's just said this free market is this eternal peace, where we're just gonna everybody's gonna compete. The competition is about who can serve the customer the best, and so it's a competition of service. And this is coming from Robert Sirico, his book Defending the Free Market, where he talks about how the free market is basically just designed to have everybody compete in making the best thing to serve the customer's needs. So serving someone's needs is in itself a good thing. Serving somebody's needs, somebody has a need, I give them the service, and this other person is actually serving this need better, so he gets that. And so the system just sort of creates this wealth. And I think that is very true. I think we can observe that. That's something that we can measure. We can actually see the poverty rates between like 1800 to the present. They have dramatically been alleviated all across the globe. Just introducing the free market, people doing business, entrepreneurship, people rising out of poverty because they can have their own business in this free market, and they can compete with one another, and they can create new things, the innovation. And not only that, we've got indoor plumbing now. We've got medical,
No toilet paper though.
Yeah, unfortunately. But we've got all these opulent luxuries. I mean, our forefathers would be so aghast to see the opulent luxuries that we live in today. And it's because of the free market, and because because of all this innovation that has happened so quickly. So I think that, in my opinion, I think that is the best argument, because ultimately it helps the poor. So that, I think, is the best argument. What, Kennedy, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's kind of the common argument, I guess, for why we look at the general living standards of people. You got that sort of hockey stick of general living standards, going up around the time of kind of what we call democratic republic sort of regimes getting popular. But I think it kind of lacks a little bit, because I think that mainly has to do with technology. And even even the technology, I think, has to do with the economic change, because it's the theorizing behind the type of market conditions we have today. They're not new. They exist 100, 200. I mean, you could probably find something in antiquity that would allude to something like that. But it's not really possible without products for people to consume. It's not really possible without the ability to transport things large distances, to have, you can't really have a free market in the sense that we understand it today with large consumer bases if you don't have access to large consumer bases. And having access to large consumer bases is largely a technological problem. So I think it's sort of a chicken or the egg thing. I think they both kind of need each other, if that makes sense. And you could probably argue one way or the other, but I think the tech is the most important. But also I would say poverty is very relative. Here in Ontario, Canada, if you are poor, you're on the welfare system, whatever, You've got running water and air conditioning, and you probably have enough food to get overweight and whatever, and that's great. And I'm glad that people are not like dying on the street, but they would call themselves impoverished. Okay, if you look at the life of a medieval nobleman, he lives a life where he actually, even if you look at the life of a medieval peasant, there's a lot of myths about them. They still ate 2-3 square meals a day. They ate quite well. They had good teeth. That's actually a myth. They had bad teeth. Aside from various medical interventions that have stopped lots of the various strange diseases and premature deaths, people's lives were, generally speaking, pretty good. The poverty that has been alleviated by these liberal societies, I think, has been created by these liberal societies. If you look at the mechanization of the farms and the sort of rural exodus that occurred even here in Canada, especially in places like England, et cetera, which is why I sympathize with the distributists like Chesterton and Belloc, because they sort of saw that happening, or the aftermath of it. There was a huge destruction of the family. You had large swaths of young men leaving the farms because there was no work there anymore, and they were going into the cities, and they were working these long jobs, long hours, and they had nothing to do except sort of spend their money, which is why prostitution got so popular, and the taverns were populated like they never had been before. And you also had a great spread of disease because the hygienic capacity was not good enough for what it needed to be. And then from there, you have some pretty good technological innovations, some pretty good financial supplementation from the various states that alleviated a lot of those things. But it's like they fixed a problem that was sort of a result of the ethos that took place, that they needed to take place in the first place. So I think it's a little too wide sweeping to say that it alleviated poverty, because I think that's mainly a medical and technological advancement. And at the same time, I would even say, like I said, and I'll let Jeremiah add into this, but I do think a lot of that poverty that we see, because we have to remember there's a great prejudice against medieval times by anything post-Enlightenment. So they're not going to talk nicely about it. A lot of that poverty was created by themselves. And even though living standards were relatively lower in the sort of medieval times, I wouldn't say quality of life necessarily was lower. And I think that's a good distinction. But anyway, what do you think, Jeremiah?
I'm with you insofar as I can say, look, the quality of life, you can look at people from all different places, not even just in space and time, or not even just in time, but also in space, and say, right. Go to different parts of the world where you have individuals living different kinds of lives in different kinds of cultures. But I sure as heck don't know very many that I would like to trade out with. I'm surrounded. I'm in the basement of a rather large home. Right? It's quite large. Historically speaking, it's a stinking castle. All I need is a moat and maybe some alligators or something. But I've got a very large home. I've got literally hundreds of books. And I've gotten rid of and even burned a couple. But I've had probably.
You're all about the burning books.
Yeah, I'm a journalist.
Not going to let you inside my library.
No, I haven't done that in a long time, and it was reserved for only the bad of the bad. And now, I just kind of get rid of them. But there's an appropriate way to get rid of certain books. But my point is, that yes. On the one hand, I can meet a lot of people who would say, I live a very fulfilled life. I don't have as much money as you. I don't have nice fluoridated water from your city. I don't have dentistry around me. I don't have candy bars at convenience stores and all that. I'm a happy person, and I'd say I'm very, very glad that you're able to be happy and fulfilled in spite of what I think are unfortunate circumstances, because I think we live in a day and age where it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And I think that I'm willing to give credit where it's due for the free market on this stuff, and say, look, this is I don't want to, maybe not 100%, but let's give it a good 85 to 90 on this, and say because of technology within the framework of a free creative process of competition, that has made it what it is, and where trying to keep things away like fraud, monopoly, coercion, things like that, market prices, a common assessment, these things are good, generally speaking. But I do want to say that there is I think that we find ourselves a lot of times having to strike a balance, and if we don't do it, that the world kind of forces it upon us, right? And history does. And with the whole thing going on right now, right? And I won't say the word because I don't want you to get in trouble with the YouTube robots, which are out right now because everybody's at home, and so now it's just the algorithm, and so we're up against that. But the thing is that we're realizing on the one, a lot of people are complaining and saying, "Oh my gosh, I wish that there were tests that could have come out quicker, and why aren't we getting this or why aren't we getting that?" And the answer is reasonable to say this, to say because there was a whole bunch of regulation. Because there was a whole bunch of regulation in place that maybe at different times was more reasonable, but then we find ourselves in a circumstance like this, and people get all in a tizzy about it and say, well, why couldn't I get it quicker? Why do I have to wait for that? And so President Trump, for example, has brought this up numerous times, talking about how he inherited a structure that was not prepared for. I think he's being generous by saying that, to say that they didn't anticipate this kind of a thing. It wasn't structured for this kind of a thing. And so on the one hand, that's like the libertarian wonderland, to say, look at this. It verifies and validates our libertarianism and our classical liberal ideas about this. On the other hand, they're going to have to eat some crow too, because there's a dynamic of this where people go, okay, well, we want to get our medicine, and even if the government says we're going to deregulate and make it so that you can make it quicker and not have to jump through all these hoops, the problem is it's still going to take a long time to do that, and people want it now. And they say, well, why can't we get it now? And you go, because it's being made in a communist country that hates our guts and has used it as leverage to say, hey, look, if you guys are going to keep saying it came from us, even we know it did, right? That if you want to keep doing what you're doing, we will let you just wallow in this problem, and we will withhold from you. If you play nice, we play nice. They're using it as leverage. Now, the situation here, it really goes to the problem with this, the way that comparative advantage has been understood and played out by free marketeers and free traders, to say, well, it's just a comparative advantage of the market that China makes these medicines. And what, you had George Bush's guy, forget what his name was, that said it doesn't matter if we make microchips or potato chips. Well, apparently it matters if we don't make ventilators. It matters if we don't make medicine. It matters if we don't make masks. It matters if we don't make a lot of things that for the general well-being and the common good of the republic would be necessary. And so on the one hand, the libertarian's a happy person, the classical liberal is a happy person economically with the decrease of regulation in times like this, to say, ha, look, I'm right. And yet on the other hand, they will have to pull some toes out of their mouth on this one to realize, in fact, it does actually matter if you make microchips or potato chips, or it matters that you're making it at all, and that it's something that you, as your country, especially if you're able to, that you're able to control. And to sum that all up is just to simply say, I think it throws us back into a world that's comfortable for people like Timothy Gordon. I don't know where Gordon would stand on this. I'd love to hear. Maybe he'll talk about it. But to say the position on Adam Smith's exceptions, a lot of these marketeers, they talk about Adam Smith, and yet a lot of them kind of they don't like talking about the exceptions that he had, and they focus more on the works of Mises or Rothbard, and to rely upon them in this radical kind of laissez-faire, and this more current understanding of comparative advantage. But I'd be interested to hear his thoughts about that, because I think that is playing itself out now, that those exceptions, in fact, are prescient, and that Adam Smith had a good grip on this, and to that degree, he was a good liberal. I did want to say one thing about John, and I'll make it really fast, is that one thing to give him, to throw a bone in his direction, okay, and to say that I think he was being a little bit more forthright on this particular thing than Timothy Gordon was when he admitted that Leo seems to be indicating that he was for the trashing of books. Okay, that he was okay with this idea that that there would be, when it came to freedom of the press, that the state in fact had a responsibility. And that is what Leo seems to be saying, is that the state in fact has a role to prevent this sort of thing, which, you know, is extremely controversial for somebody who says that, well, freedom of the press, he was, you know, Leo was down with the sickness on this. Right? He was totally hardcore. He was neck deep in it. And I think that John was at least more forthright on that particular thing. And again, if Timothy feels that I'm incorrect on this as well, I'd love to hear what he has to say about it.
Excellent. So yeah, John and Timothy, if you want to respond to anything here, once again, we want to be fair to everybody, especially since you left the broadcast, not for, we don't want to. I want to give you your voice so that we're not just criticizing you while you're not here. So come back on. We want this to be the beginning of more and more talking about this, because this issue is very divisive among Catholics, and the mission of this apostolate is to unite Catholics against the enemies of Holy Church. And so we need to unite and hash these things out. Doesn't mean we have to agree on particular things that we can licitly disagree about, but doesn't mean we need to have charity and pursue truth together as brothers. So I want this to be the beginning of more conversation about this. We are in an election year in America, unless the virus somehow cancels the election or something. But we'll have some more guests too. I've got a few more guests coming down the pike. I got a guy who's going to talk more about African politics, Nigeria. I've got a British citizen also. If you want to talk about politics in your country, and it's not Canada and it's not America, not the other two aforementioned countries, I want to talk to you so we could talk more about Catholics dealing with politics everywhere around the globe. We didn't talk about the other two big ones, which are Marxism and feminism. And those are the other two big ones we didn't even go into yet. So this is going to be the beginning of more and more conversations about this year as we continue to reflect. And we're all just sitting around our home, quarantined. We can reflect on all these high philosophical ideas. So we'll continue to talk about this. Timothy and John, if you want to come back on, talk more, respond to anything, let me know. I wanted to make a quick note for anybody who has a baptism or a marriage. Just a reminder, any man or any woman, layman or laywoman, can perform a valid baptism on a child if you intend to do what the church intends. You pour water on the child 3 times and you say, "Name, I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." And that is a valid baptism. But you can only do it if the priest is not available. So if you can't get a priest, or if there's a danger of death, if the child is about to die and you think there's a danger of death, you can baptize as well. That is a valid baptism. Just a reminder, that is the baptism that can be done if there's a grave cause. Also, and I'm going to do a show more about this because I haven't studied this topic, but Kennedy relayed to me that he talked to his priest who said that if there is a grave inconvenience for a marriage, so if you're engaged to be married and the bishop is suspended, everything, whatever, there shouldn't be any marriages being scheduled in Lent right now, but maybe you're scheduled out and we're whatever quarantined. But if there's a grave inconvenience, which is supposed to be about a month delay, you can do the marriage with 2 witnesses and just take vows and then validate it later with the priest. Yeah. So apparently that's something, and I'm going to go into the moral theology of that more in detail in the video that I'll do probably next week. So, but if you have questions about that, you can let me know, or Kennedy. Let's see, what else would I want to mention?
They'd have to violate quarantine in order to meet up.
Yeah.
It's like, well, maybe you're already cohabitating.
But
in the situation, you're all quarantined in the same house. Yeah, like a Three's a Company situation.
So we got to wrap up here. Let's all pray. Let's all.
Can I just say one last thing?
Go ahead, Kennedy.
Just
yeah.
I did a little video on the whole Mexican beer cold not virus but something else. I think we didn't really get into this. We thought we were going to talk about liberalism and this whole situation we're in. Whatever people might say about good liberalism, bad liberalism, whatever they might say, we live in an age where we are completely dependent on the state, literally for our toilet paper. And when you become dependent on the state for your toilet paper, it shows that you've got you-know-what for brains, okay? And I think people keep saying, oh, is this a punishment from God? I don't know. I'm pretty skeptical about the seriousness of it. That's a whole other thing. However, I do think that it is a punishment, at least in the mental sphere. And we've shown that we don't know how to trust God. We don't know how to rely on things that Catholics would have relied on for centuries. You know, I mean, we live in a time where we're all in crisis and we're told we shouldn't visit our families. Like, it's insane. And we're listening to the state, you know, and, you know, we need medications from a place that has a disease and they won't give them to us. Like, it's just nuts. And all of this is happening in a world of these liberal democracies or communist, whatever, dictatorships, which are just another extent of liberalism in the bad sense. Okay. So I think that we need to take a good and hard look at the fruits of the governmental regimes we've had for the last 100 and 150 years. And I think that the situation we're in might have something to do with that, at least in how we react to it. I'm not saying it's like some ploy and conspiracy. They created it maybe. But I do think that our inability to deal with this like competent human beings, and we're sitting there and we're watching CNN and looking at our phones to see, you know, what directive is coming out, all the confusion. It just shows how dangerous it is when we buy into the real bad liberalism where we rely on the state for literally everything, including how we can wipe our rear ends.
Yeah, it's like 9/11. Donald Rumsfeld had a meeting a few hours after 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
He had a meeting and he said in the meeting, "Is this enough to go after Saddam Hussein?"
Yeah.
The elites will use this, whether or not it's a real crisis or it's not, whatever. The elites are going to use this for their power and their ends. We know that for sure. We can all agree on that, I hope.
Already have.
You don't have to be conspiratorial. You can just you just need to realize that this will be used, whether it's real or it's not. It will be used by elites for their own ends.
Wasn't it Rahm Emanuel that talked about not letting a good crisis go to waste?
Never let a good crisis go to waste.
I want to say one more thing too. I want to say, and not about any of this, but I want to say this about Catholic liberals, is that I hold certain Catholic liberals in high regard. I have a great admiration for Tom Woods Jr., for example. I disagree with him. I've written very critical articles when I was at the Distributist Review. I wrote critical articles about Tom Woods Jr., but I also respect him a great deal. Same thing with Jeffrey Tucker. Same thing with Tim Gordon. I absolutely respect him. I respect his mind. I respect his work. I respect his life and his heart. And in fact, I major props to him in his marriage and the kind of his video even on suffering and things like that, and children in children's hospitals. Even Steve Skojic. I mean, I named my little Skoji headphones after him. Obviously, he means a great deal. But in all seriousness, I the work that he does, I have disagreements with him. But at the same time, mad respect. Michael Novak. You know, there are, and of course, Father Robert Sirico. He's one of my greatest heroes in my life, right? On many different levels. And I feel that it's easy to get caught up in saying, well, I disagree with this or I disagree with that. And it's easy to lose sight of the fact that this is an in-house debate, and that these people are powerful witnesses to the Catholic faith. They've led many people to the truth. They are making huge, dramatic, using their model, their worldview, their understanding of freedom, their understanding of liberty and subsidiarity and the like. They've used that to transform local cultures where they are. And I'm part of one of those. My family's part of one of those when we're not quarantined, right? But even then. And so I just wanted to just say that as a final thought, just to say my heart about it, and just say I have mad respect. I love the debate, and I love the ideas back and forth. I've learned a great deal over time. My views have been tempered over time, in fact, on some of this, and it's because of their work. And so, all of the things aside, mad respect, lots of prayer, and I'm glad to call them brothers in the Lord.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. All right, let's pray. In the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
In the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen.